My name is Maya Chen, and at exactly 2:47 p.m. on a Tuesday that changed everything, I stood in Conference Room 4B of the Pentagon watching Victoria Blackwood, the woman who married my father and spent 15 years telling me I'd never amount to anything, stare at a check for $12 million. Her perfectly manicured fingers trembled as she held the cashier's check made out to me, and for the first time in my adult life, I watched my stepmother's composure crack like expensive porcelain hitting concrete. The silence in that government-issued beige room was so thick you could taste the decades of buried resentment. Before we jump back in, tell us where you're tuning in from, and if this story touches you, make sure you're subscribed, because tomorrow, I've saved something extra special for you. The man who'd written that check sat across from us, calm as morning coffee. James Rothwell, founder of Rothwell International Properties, owned more commercial real estate than most small countries. His steel gray eyes hadn't left my face since he'd slid the check across the table, and when he spoke, his voice carried the kind of quiet authority that comes from never having to raise it. Miss Chen, I'm prepared to double that offer if you'll consider selling the entire floor. I grew up in a house where ownership was a four-letter word, at least for me. After my mother passed when I was 11, my father remarried within 18 months to Victoria Blackwood, a real estate agent who specialized in luxury properties and making me feel like a trespasser in my own home. She moved into our modest three-bedroom house in Arlington with her twin sons, Marcus and David, and immediately began what I now recognize as a systematic campaign to erase any trace of my mother's presence. The first thing to go were the family photos. Victoria claimed they made the house feel dated and replaced them with generic art pieces that could have come from any hotel lobby. My mother's garden tools disappeared from the garage, her recipe books vanished from the kitchen, and even the small ceramic owl she'd kept on the windowsill somehow found its way into a donation box. When I asked my father about these disappearances, he'd give me that look, the one that said I was being dramatic, oversensitive, difficult. Victoria had a way of speaking that made everything sound reasonable while cutting deep. At dinner parties, she'd introduce Marcus and David as my brilliant boys, while referring to me as Richard's daughter from his first marriage, as if I were some artifact he'd inherited, rather than his actual child. When I brought home straight A's from high school, she'd smile that plastic smile and say, "How wonderful, Maya. Of course, grades are just one piece of the puzzle. Real success comes from understanding how the world actually works." The twins absorbed her poison like sponges. Marcus, older by 12 minutes and never let anyone forget it, developed a talent for subtle cruelty. He'd accidentally delete my homework files from the shared computer, borrow my textbooks, and return them damaged, or invite everyone from our class to parties except me. David, quieter but no less calculating, preferred psychological warfare. He'd start rumors at school about my family's financial situation, claiming we were struggling because my father had to support Richard's first wife's kid on top of everything else. What hurt most wasn't their cruelty. It was my father's willingness to believe their version of every story. When I complained about Marcus deleting my files, my father suggested I was being careless with my work. When I mentioned David's rumors, he accused me of being paranoid. Victoria had masterfully positioned herself as the voice of reason in every conflict, always ready with a perfectly logical explanation for why I was wrong, why I was overreacting, why I needed to adjust my attitude. The house itself became a battlefield of ownership. My mother's old sewing room was converted into a home office for Victoria's real estate business. My childhood bedroom was gradually taken over by the twins' belongings, their video game consoles, their sports equipment, their extra furniture. When I protested, Victoria would sigh and explain how important it was for the family to share resources, and how my hoarding mentality wasn't healthy for anyone. By the time I graduated high school, I'd learned to make myself invisible. I ate dinner quickly and retreated to what remained of my space. I stopped bringing friends home because Victoria had a gift for making casual comments that left them uncomfortable. I saved every dollar from my part-time job at the local coffee shop, not because I had specific plans, but because I instinctively understood that money meant freedom, and freedom meant escape. College was my salvation, even though Victoria made sure I understood it was a financial burden on the family. "I hope you realize how fortunate you are," she'd say while reviewing the tuition bills. "Not everyone gets these opportunities handed to them." The subtext was clear. I owed them everything, and I was already failing to live up to their generosity. I chose George Washington University for its business program, but what really drew me was its proximity to the Pentagon and other government buildings. Something about those structures fascinated me. The way they represented permanence, authority, the kind of institutional power that couldn't be taken away by someone's opinion of you. I spent hours walking around the Pentagon's perimeter during my freshman year, studying its architecture, imagining what it would feel like to belong somewhere that solid. My interest in real estate started accidentally during a microeconomics class. Professor Williams was explaining market inefficiencies when he mentioned the unique challenges of government property leasing. The Pentagon, for instance, houses thousands of contractors and consultants who need office space, but the approval process for new leases can take years. There's a significant arbitrage opportunity for someone who understands both bureaucracy and real estate. That night, I went home and researched everything I could find about government property regulations, contractor requirements, and the Pentagon's specific leasing policies. What I discovered was a labyrinth of rules that most people found overwhelming, but to me it looked like a map. Every regulation had exceptions. Every process had shortcuts. Every barrier had a key if you knew where to look. I started small during my sophomore year, identifying contractors who were struggling to find appropriate office space near their Pentagon assignments. Using my student status and my father's military connections, he was a logistics coordinator for the Department of Defense, I managed to get access to surplus space listings that weren't widely advertised. I'd find small offices or conference rooms that were technically available but buried in bureaucratic red tape, then help contractors navigate the approval process in exchange for a finder's fee. Victoria noticed my activities when she saw me reviewing property documents at the kitchen table one evening. "What's all this paperwork, Maya?" she asked in that tone that made simple questions sound like accusations. I explained my small consulting business, how I was helping government contractors find office space. I thought she might be impressed, or at least acknowledged that I was showing entrepreneurial initiative. Instead, she laughed, not the warm kind of laughter that brings people together, but the sharp kind that cuts. "Oh, sweetheart," she said, collecting my papers and flipping through them like they were children's drawings. "This is adorable." But you do realize that real estate is about relationships, right? About trust and reputation and knowing the right people. You can't just read some regulations and think you understand how business actually works. She handed the papers back to me with a smile that didn't reach her eyes. "I admire your ambition, truly I do. But maybe you should focus on getting your degree first. Leave the property business to people who actually understand it." That night, I lay in my dorm room staring at the ceiling and feeling something harden inside my chest. Not anger, exactly, but something colder and more useful. Determination. Victoria had spent years telling me what I couldn't do, what I wasn't capable of, what I'd never achieve. But she'd made one crucial mistake. She'd underestimated how carefully I'd been listening, how thoroughly I'd been learning, and how desperately I wanted to prove her wrong. I didn't stop my consulting work. I expanded it. By my junior year, I had a network of 15 regular clients and had successfully facilitated over 40 office leases in the Pentagon and surrounding government buildings. I wasn't just reading regulations anymore. I was finding loopholes, building relationships with facilities managers, and developing a reputation as someone who could solve problems that stumped more experienced professionals. But Victoria's words had planted a seed of doubt that grew in the quiet moments. Maybe she was right about relationships being everything. Maybe my small successes were just luck. Maybe I was fooling myself into thinking I understood a world that would always see me as an outsider. That doubt became a driving force. Every morning, I'd wake up thinking about Victoria's condescending smile, about her certainty that I'd never own anything worth having. And every day, I'd work a little harder, study a little longer, push a little further into the complex world of government real estate. I didn't know it then, but I was building toward something much bigger than a college consulting business. I was preparing for the moment when Victoria's predictions would crash against the reality of what I'd actually accomplished. I was getting ready to own something she couldn't take away, couldn't diminish, and couldn't explain away with her perfectly reasonable excuses. The Pentagon became my second home during those college years. I knew which elevators were fastest, which security guards were friendliest, which floors had the best coffee machines. I understood the rhythm of the building, the ebb and flow of meetings and deadlines that created opportunities for someone patient enough to watch and smart enough to act. What I didn't understand yet was that I wasn't just learning about real estate. I was learning about power, how it worked, where it lived, and most importantly, how to claim it for myself. 6 months after graduation, I signed the lease on Office Suite 3847 in the Pentagon's contractor wing. The space was barely 400 square feet, wedged between a cybersecurity firm and a military logistics consultant, with fluorescent lighting that hummed like a dying insect, and windows that faced a concrete wall. But it was mine. The lease agreement bore my signature. My business license hung on the wall, and every morning when I unlocked that door, I felt something Victoria had never allowed me to experience: the weight of legitimate ownership. Chen's Strategic Property Solutions started with a folding table, 2 metal chairs from a government surplus sale, and a desktop computer I'd assembled from parts. My first major contract came through persistence, rather than connections. The Defense Intelligence Agency needed temporary office space for a classified project team, but their requirements were so specific that 3 established firms had already declined the job. They needed soundproof walls, electromagnetic shielding, proximity to secure communication lines, and occupancy within 2 weeks. I spent 3 days walking every floor of the Pentagon, measuring unused spaces, checking building schematics, and talking to maintenance staff who knew which areas met the technical requirements. I found a forgotten conference room on the 4th floor that had been used for sensitive briefings during the Cold War. The shielding was outdated but functional, the soundproofing was military grade, and it had been sitting empty for 8 months, while bureaucrats argued about its official designation. The approval process should have taken 6 weeks. I had it completed in 9 days by identifying which forms could be filed simultaneously rather than sequentially, which officials had the authority to expedite reviews, and which regulations contained emergency provisions for national security projects. When I handed over the keys to the DIA project manager, he looked at me like I'd performed magic. Word spread quickly in the small world of Pentagon contractors. Within 6 months, I had 11 active clients and a waiting list. Within a year, I'd expanded into 3 additional offices and hired 2 assistants. My business wasn't just finding space anymore. I was solving problems that established firms couldn't or wouldn't handle, navigating bureaucratic mazes that intimidated people with decades more experience. Victoria remained unimpressed. During family dinners, she'd listen to my updates with the same expression she used for weather reports: politely attentive, but fundamentally indifferent. When I mentioned landing a contract with a major defense contractor, she'd nod and change the subject to Marcus's latest promotion at his law firm, or David's engagement to a senator's daughter. When I bought a new car to replace my college beater, she commented that it was practical, and immediately began discussing the luxury vehicles her real estate clients drove. The twins had settled into their roles as Victoria's success stories. Marcus had joined a white shoe law firm in downtown D.C., handling mergers and acquisitions for Fortune 500 companies. David worked for a prestigious lobbying group, specializing in defense policy and government relations. They moved through Washington's social circles, with the easy confidence of people who'd never doubted their place in the world, collecting connections and climbing ladders that had been built specifically for people like them. At my father's 60th birthday party, Victoria made a toast that perfectly captured her worldview. She raised her wine glass and smiled at the gathered relatives and family friends, her voice warm with practiced sincerity. Richard is so fortunate to have such accomplished children. Marcus just made partner, and David's firm represents some of the most influential voices in Washington. Even Maya has her little consulting business helping people find office space. It's wonderful to see everyone contributing in their own way. The casual diminishment stung not because it was harsh, but because it was subtle enough that anyone who called it out would seem petty. My little consulting business had generated more revenue that year than Marcus's salary. But Victoria had managed to frame it as a charming hobby rather than a legitimate enterprise. I smiled and raised my own glass, swallowing both the wine and the urge to correct the record. The real test came during my third year in business when the Pentagon announced a major reorganization of contractor services. New regulations would require all existing leases to be reviewed and potentially renegotiated, a process that typically took 18 months and cost millions in legal fees and administrative overhead. Most of my competitors viewed it as a disaster, too complex, too risky, too likely to result in clients losing their current spaces while waiting for approvals. I saw it as the opportunity I'd been preparing for since college. While other firms advise their clients to brace for disruption, I spent 2 months studying the new regulations, identifying transition pathways, and developing a systematic approach to the renewal process. I created detailed timelines, backup options, and contingency plans for every conceivable scenario. Then I made the biggest gamble of my professional life. I contacted my 53 active clients and offered them a deal. I would handle their entire lease transition for a flat fee, guaranteeing that they'd maintain continuous occupancy throughout the reorganization. If I failed to deliver, they'd owe me nothing. If I succeeded, they'd pay my fee plus a 20% efficiency bonus. 47 clients accepted the offer. Victoria heard about my proposal through my father, who'd learned about it from someone at the Department of Defense. Her reaction was swift and predictable. She called me at my office on a Thursday afternoon, her voice thick with the kind of concern that mothers use when their children are about to make terrible mistakes. "Maya, sweetheart, I'm worried about you. This sounds incredibly risky. What happens if you can't deliver what you've promised? You could lose everything you've built. Maybe you should consider partnering with a more established firm, someone with the resources and experience to handle something this complex." I explained my research, my preparation, my confidence in the approach. She listened with the patience of someone waiting for a child to finish explaining why they deserved ice cream for breakfast. When I finished, she sighed that particular sigh, the one that conveyed disappointment mixed with resignation. "I admire your optimism, truly I do. But real estate is about managing risk, not taking wild gambles. You're still young, and you haven't been through a real crisis yet. When things go wrong, and they will go wrong, you'll understand why experience matters more than enthusiasm." That conversation played in my head for weeks as I worked 18-hour days coordinating lease renewals, navigating regulatory reviews, and managing client expectations. Every morning, I'd wake up with Victoria's words echoing in my ears. When things go wrong, and they will go wrong. Every evening, I'd fall asleep reviewing checklists and contingency plans, determined to prove that preparation could overcome experience. The reorganization launched on a Monday in October. By Wednesday, chaos had erupted throughout the Pentagon contractor community. Established firms were struggling with paperwork backlogs, clients were panicking about potential relocations, and the usual approval processes had slowed to a crawl as overwhelmed officials tried to process hundreds of simultaneous requests. My systematic approach worked exactly as I'd planned. While other firms were still trying to understand the new requirements, I was already submitting completed applications. While my competitors were scheduling initial meetings with regulatory officials, I was receiving approved renewals. By Friday of that first week, 32 of my 47 clients had secured their new leases. By the end of the month, all 47 were successfully transitioned, with zero interruption to their operations. The success was impossible to ignore. Pentagon officials started referring other contractors to me specifically. Defense industry publications wrote articles about my, quote, innovative approach to regulatory compliance. A major real estate trade magazine featured me on their cover with the headline, "The Pentagon Whisperer: How One Young Entrepreneur Mastered Military Bureaucracy." But Victoria's response to my success was perhaps the most revealing moment in our 15-year relationship. At Thanksgiving dinner, surrounded by extended family and friends, someone mentioned seeing my magazine cover. Victoria smiled that perfect hostess smile and nodded approvingly. "We're so proud of Maya's success," she said, her voice carrying just the right note of maternal warmth. "Of course, she's benefited tremendously from growing up in a family that understands government work. Richard's connections and my experience in real estate have given her such wonderful advantages. It's lovely to see her making good use of the foundation we've provided." The casual rewriting of history was breathtaking in its audacity. The woman who'd spent years telling me I'd never own anything, who'd dismissed my business as a little consulting venture, who'd warned me against taking the very risks that led to my success, was now claiming credit for achievements she'd actively discouraged. I sat at that dinner table listening to Victoria spin her revisionist narrative and felt something shift inside me. Not anger, but clarity. I finally understood that Victoria's dismissal had never been about protecting me from failure or helping me develop realistic expectations. It had been about maintaining a hierarchy where she remained the authority on what was possible, valuable, and worthwhile. My success threatened that hierarchy because it proved that her predictions had been wrong, her advice had been counterproductive, and her understanding of my capabilities had been fundamentally flawed. Rather than acknowledge those errors, she was simply rewriting the story to preserve her position as the wise voice of experience. That night, I made a decision that would change everything. I was going to pursue the one opportunity that would make my success impossible to diminish, impossible to explain away, and impossible to claim as anyone's achievement but my own. I was going to acquire the Pentagon office space that every major real estate firm in Washington had been trying to secure for over a decade. The crown jewel, as industry insiders called it, was a full floor of prime Pentagon real estate that had been tied up in legal disputes since the early 2000s. Multiple ownership claims, regulatory complications, and political sensitivities had made it untouchable for established firms. But I'd been quietly researching the situation for 2 years. I believed I'd found a path through the legal maze, and more importantly, I believed I had the patience and determination to see it through. Victoria had spent years telling me I'd never own anything that mattered. Preparing and narrating this story took us a lot of time, so if you are enjoying it, subscribe to our channel. It means a lot to us. Now back to the story. I was about to prove her spectacularly wrong. The crown jewel case files filled 3 bankers' boxes that I kept stacked in the corner of my office like a monument to complexity. For 18 months, I'd been dissecting every document, court filing, and regulatory decision related to Pentagon Floor 7, Section C. The 12,000 square feet of premium office space had been disputed territory since 2003, when the original military contractor went bankrupt mid-lease, leaving behind a tangle of claims from creditors, subcontractors, and government agencies. Most real estate professionals looked at the crown jewel and saw an impossible puzzle. I saw a chess game where previous players had focused on the obvious moves while ignoring the subtle ones. The key wasn't in the primary ownership disputes that had dominated court proceedings for years. It was buried in a 1987 environmental assessment that had classified a small portion of the floor as requiring specialized remediation protocols. Every subsequent legal battle had treated this classification as a minor technical detail, but I recognized it as the thread that could unravel the entire knot. Environmental classifications created separate regulatory pathways under federal property law. If I could demonstrate that the environmental concerns had been resolved through building upgrades completed in 2019, the affected portion of the floor would revert to standard government lease procedures. More importantly, it would invalidate 3 of the major ownership claims that were preventing the space from being released to new tenants. The technical challenge was enormous. I needed to coordinate environmental surveys, building inspections, regulatory approvals, and legal documentation across 4 different government agencies. Each agency had its own timeline, priorities, and approval processes. Most firms would have needed a team of specialists and 18 months to navigate the requirements. I had myself, 2 assistants, and a deadline imposed by my own ambition rather than external pressure. The financial risk was equally daunting. The environmental surveys alone cost $47,000. Legal fees for the property classification review added another $32,000. I was investing nearly every dollar of profit my business had generated over the past 2 years, betting everything on a strategy that had never been tested and might not work. Victoria learned about my pursuit of the crown jewel through my father, who'd heard rumors at the Pentagon about my environmental assessment filings. Her reaction was swift and decisive. She appeared at my office on a gray February morning, wearing her most expensive coat and the expression she reserved for interventions. "Maya, we need to talk." She settled into the chair across from my desk without waiting for an invitation, her eyes scanning the towers of legal documents and technical reports that covered every available surface. Your father is concerned about the risks you're taking. This Pentagon project you're pursuing, it's beyond your capabilities. You're going to bankrupt yourself, chasing something that real professionals have been unable to secure for 20 years. I set down the regulatory manual I'd been reviewing and met her gaze directly. I appreciate the concern, but I've done my research. I understand the challenges, and I have a viable strategy. Victoria's laugh was sharp and familiar. A viable strategy? Maya, do you have any idea how many established firms have tried to acquire that space? Companies with teams of lawyers, decades of experience, and connections you could never access. What makes you think you can succeed where they've all failed? She leaned forward, her voice taking on that tone of patient explanation she'd perfected over the years. I've been in real estate for 25 years. I've seen countless people overextend themselves chasing properties they couldn't handle. The smart move is to focus on what you know, what you can manage. Don't gamble away everything you've built on an impossible dream. Her words carried the weight of authority, the certainty of someone who'd never doubted her own judgment. But this time, instead of undermining my confidence, they crystallized my resolve. Victoria had been wrong about my potential for 15 years. She'd been wrong about my business prospects, wrong about my capabilities, and wrong about my understanding of real estate. I was willing to bet she was wrong about this too. The environmental assessment took 6 weeks and produced a 400-page report concluding that all contamination concerns had been resolved through building renovations completed in 2019. The regulatory review required another 8 weeks of meetings, document submissions, and technical clarifications. The legal classification process involved 3 separate hearings and required testimony from environmental engineers, building contractors, and government facilities managers. Each step forward felt like defusing a bomb while wearing mittens. One misplaced document, one missed deadline, one bureaucratic miscommunication could have unraveled months of work. I slept in my office most nights during the final phase, surviving on coffee and determination, double-checking every form and triple-checking every regulation. On a Wednesday morning in late April, I received the call that changed everything. The Pentagon's Property Management Office had approved my environmental classification review. Floor 7, Section C was cleared for standard lease procedures, effective immediately. 3 major ownership claims had been invalidated, and the space was available for the first qualified applicant. I submitted my lease application 27 minutes after receiving the approval call. By Thursday afternoon, I held a signed lease agreement for the crown jewel, the most coveted office space in the Pentagon's contractor wing. The monthly rent was substantial enough to make me dizzy, but I'd secured a 5-year term with options for renewal. After 2 decades of legal limbo, Floor 7, Section C belonged to Chen Strategic Property Solutions. The real estate industry's response was immediate and intense. Trade publications ran features analyzing my approach. Established firms sent representatives to congratulate me and subtly inquire about subletting opportunities. Pentagon officials who'd ignored my calls for years suddenly wanted to schedule meetings to discuss future projects. But the moment that defined everything happened 3 weeks after I moved into my new offices. James Rothwell's assistant called on a Tuesday morning to request a meeting. Rothwell International Properties owned more commercial real estate than most cities, with a portfolio spanning continents and generating billions in annual revenue. James Rothwell didn't take meetings with small contractors. He certainly didn't request meetings with young women who'd been in business for less than 5 years. I assumed the meeting was about potential collaboration or consulting opportunities. Perhaps Rothwell wanted local expertise for a Pentagon area project. When he arrived with his team of attorneys and financial advisors, I expected discussion about contract terms or partnership structures. Instead, he opened a leather portfolio and placed a document on my conference table. Ms. Chen, I'm here to make an offer for your Pentagon holdings. We're prepared to purchase your entire lease portfolio, including the crown jewel, for $12 million cash. The number hung in the air like smoke from an explosion. $12 million for property I'd acquired through research, persistence, and calculated risk-taking. Property that Victoria had warned me against pursuing, that established firms had declared impossible to obtain, that represented everything I'd built from nothing. Rothwell continued speaking, explaining his company's expansion plans and their need for strategic Pentagon access, but his words faded into background noise. All I could think about was Victoria's voice from 20 years ago, telling an 11-year-old girl that she'd never own anything important, never achieve anything meaningful, never amount to more than a burden on people who actually mattered. I looked across the table at this real estate mogul who commanded resources I couldn't imagine, offering to pay more money than I'd dreamed of accumulating in a lifetime, for property I'd acquired through nothing but intelligence, determination, and refusal to accept other people's limitations. The girl Victoria had dismissed as worthless owned something that billionaires wanted to buy. "Mr. Rothwell," I said, my voice steady despite the earthquake happening inside my chest. "I'm flattered by your offer, but I'm not interested in selling." His eyebrows rose slightly. "Miss Chen, this is an extremely generous offer. $12 million represents a significant premium over current market valuations. Perhaps you'd like time to consider." "I don't need time," I interrupted. "I didn't acquire this property to flip it for profit. I built something here, something that can't be replicated through connections or capital. I'm not interested in trading that for money." Rothwell studied my face for a long moment, then smiled. Not the practiced smile of business negotiation, but something warmer and more genuine. $14 million then, and I'll throw in consulting contracts for any future Pentagon projects my company pursues. The figure was breathtaking, life-changing, generational wealth offered for property I'd owned for less than 6 months. But selling would mean admitting that Victoria had been right about one thing, that ownership was ultimately about converting assets into cash, about taking profits rather than building something lasting. "Mr. Rothwell, I appreciate your persistence, but my answer remains the same. The crown jewel isn't for sale." After they left, I sat alone in my Pentagon office, looking out at the concrete wall that had been my view when I started with 400 square feet and a folding table. The space around me hummed with activity. My staff coordinating client projects, phones ringing with new opportunities, the machinery of a successful business I'd built from nothing but stubborn refusal to accept other people's predictions about my future. That evening, I drove to my father's house for what had become our monthly family dinner. Victoria greeted me at the door with her usual polite warmth, but I noticed something different in her expression. A calculation, a reassessment of variables that no longer added up the way they once had. During dinner, she asked about my recent success with casual interest that fooled no one. "Your father mentioned you'd acquired some significant property at the Pentagon. That must be very exciting." "It is," I replied, not elaborating. "I imagine there are excellent opportunities for profit-taking in that market. Property like that must generate substantial interest from investors." I met her eyes across the table, remembering every dismissal, every warning, every prediction that I'd never amount to anything worth mentioning. "Actually, I turned down a $14 million offer this week." The silence that followed was profound. Victoria's fork paused halfway to her mouth. Marcus looked up from his phone for the first time all evening. David actually stopped chewing. My father stared at me like I'd announced I was moving to Mars. $14 million? Victoria repeated, her voice carefully neutral. "James Rothwell wanted to buy my Pentagon portfolio." I declined. Victoria set down her fork and composed herself with visible effort. That's quite a substantial offer. Are you certain it was wise to refuse? Real estate markets can be unpredictable, and timing is everything in property investment. For the first time in my adult life, I heard uncertainty in Victoria's voice. Not the confident authority she'd wielded for 15 years, but the tentative probing of someone trying to understand a situation that exceeded her expertise. She was still trying to offer advice, still positioning herself as the voice of wisdom, but the foundation had shifted beneath her feet. "I'm certain," I said simply. "I didn't build this business to cash out at the first big offer. I built it to own something that matters." The conversation moved on to other topics, but something fundamental had changed in the room's dynamics. Victoria's casual dismissals carried less weight. Her confident pronouncements about business and success sounded more like opinions than facts. The hierarchy she'd maintained through years of psychological positioning had been quietly overturned by the simple reality of what I'd accomplished. Later that night, I stood in my Pentagon office, looking out at the lights of Washington stretching toward the horizon. Victoria had spent 20 years telling me I'd never own anything worth having. I owned something a billionaire wanted to buy. She'd told me I didn't understand how the real world worked. I'd navigated legal and regulatory challenges that had stumped firms with decades more experience. She'd predicted I'd never amount to anything meaningful. I'd built something that mattered enough for the most successful real estate investor in the country to personally offer me generational wealth. The girl who'd been told she'd never own anything had just turned down $14 million because what she owned was worth more than money. Victoria's prophecies had become my motivation. Her limitations had become my launching pad, and her certainty about my future had become the foundation for achievements she'd never imagined possible. I didn't need her recognition anymore. I had something better. The quiet satisfaction of proving that her version of my story had been wrong from the very beginning. The news of my refusal to sell spread through Washington's real estate circles like wildfire through dry grass. Within a week, 3 more major investors had approached me with increasingly aggressive offers. A private equity firm offered $16 million plus equity stakes in their other properties. A foreign investment consortium proposed $18 million with guaranteed consulting contracts. Each rejection seemed to generate 2 more inquiries from buyers who couldn't comprehend why anyone would turn down generational wealth. But the most interesting reaction came from an unexpected source. Victoria began showing up at my office unannounced, always with perfectly reasonable explanations. She was in the neighborhood showing properties to clients. She wanted to see how I'd decorated my new space. She thought we should discuss some family planning for my father's upcoming retirement party. Each visit felt like reconnaissance disguised as concern. During one of these impromptu visits, she stood in my reception area, examining the framed articles about my acquisition of the crown jewel. Her expression, unreadable. "It's remarkable what you've accomplished, Maya, though I do hope you're being strategic about your next moves. Success can be just as dangerous as failure if you're not careful." There was something different in her tone, a subtle shift from the patronizing advice I'd grown accustomed to over the years. She wasn't dismissing my achievements anymore, but she also wasn't entirely acknowledging them. Instead, she seemed to be testing new ground, trying to find a way to maintain her role as the family's voice of wisdom, while adapting to a reality where her predictions had proven spectacularly wrong. "I appreciate your concern," I replied, not looking up from the contract I was reviewing. "But I'm comfortable with my strategic direction." Victoria lingered by the window overlooking the Pentagon's south parking area, her reflection ghost-like in the bulletproof glass. "You know, I've been thinking about that Rothwell offer. $14 million is extraordinary money, but I wonder if perhaps you were wise to refuse. Sometimes the value of what we build transcends its market price." The casual reversal was breathtaking in its audacity. The same woman who'd spent months warning me against pursuing the crown jewel was now suggesting that my refusal to sell demonstrated wisdom beyond my years. She was rewriting history in real time, positioning herself as someone who'd always understood the deeper value of long-term thinking. But this time, her revisionism felt different, less like manipulation and more like adaptation. Victoria had built her identity around being the authority on what was possible, valuable, and worthwhile. My success hadn't just proven her wrong. It had forced her to reconstruct her understanding of who I was and what I was capable of achieving. 3 months after the Rothwell meeting, I made a decision that surprised everyone, including myself. I announced the creation of the Pentagon Property Development Initiative, a program designed to help small businesses and emerging contractors navigate the complex world of government real estate. Using the crown jewel as my flagship property, I would sublease space to qualified tenants at below-market rates, while providing comprehensive support services to help them establish themselves in the federal contracting ecosystem. The decision made no financial sense according to traditional real estate logic. I was essentially converting my most valuable asset into a subsidized business incubator, trading maximum profit for maximum impact. Several industry publications questioned my sanity. A few competitors suggested I was having some kind of quarter-life crisis. Victoria's reaction was perhaps the most telling. She scheduled lunch at an upscale restaurant in downtown D.C., the kind of place where she entertained her highest-end clients. Over expensive salads and carefully chosen wine, she probed my motivations with the skill of a practiced interrogator. "This initiative of yours is certainly ambitious," she began, her tone carefully neutral. "Though I have to wonder about the financial implications. You're essentially giving away revenue in favor of, what exactly, community service?" I explained my vision, creating opportunities for businesses that faced the same barriers I'd encountered early in my career, building a network of successful contractors who understood the value of mutual support, establishing Chen's Strategic Property Solutions as more than just a real estate firm, but as a catalyst for broader economic development. Victoria listened with the focused attention she usually reserved for million-dollar property negotiations. When I finished, she was quiet for a long moment, twirling her wine glass between her fingers like she was buying time to process information that didn't fit her existing frameworks. "It's an interesting approach," she finally said. "Unconventional, certainly. But perhaps that's always been your strength, seeing opportunities where others see obstacles." She paused, then added something that caught me completely off guard. "I may have underestimated your strategic thinking in the past. This initiative suggests a level of business sophistication that goes beyond simple property acquisition." The admission was so subtle that someone else might have missed it entirely. But I'd been listening to Victoria's coded language for 20 years, parsing her careful phrasings for hidden meanings and unspoken judgments. This was as close to an apology as her pride would allow. Acknowledgement that her assessments of my capabilities had been flawed, wrapped in language that preserved her dignity while recognizing my growth. The Pentagon Property Development Initiative launched 6 months later with 12 initial tenant companies, each carefully selected for their potential rather than their current size. A cybersecurity startup founded by 2 women veterans. A data analytics firm specializing in defense applications, led by a former enlisted soldier who'd taught himself programming during overseas deployments. A logistics consulting company started by a military spouse who'd moved 17 times in 20 years and understood supply chain challenges better than most graduate school theorists. Each tenant received not just affordable office space, but access to my network of contacts, guidance through regulatory requirements, and mentorship in government contracting procedures. I held monthly seminars on topics ranging from security clearance applications to proposal writing. I connected tenants with potential clients, partners, and funding sources. I created the kind of supportive ecosystem I'd wished for during my own early struggles. The program's success exceeded even my optimistic projections. Within 18 months, 8 of the original 12 tenants had grown large enough to lease their own independent spaces. 7 had secured major government contracts. 3 had been acquired by larger firms for substantial sums. The Pentagon Property Development Initiative became a case study taught at business schools, and a model replicated by other property developers across the country. More importantly, it established my reputation as something beyond a successful real estate entrepreneur. I became known as someone who understood that true wealth wasn't measured only in dollars accumulated, but in opportunities created, barriers removed, and potential unleashed. The girl Victoria had dismissed as incapable of understanding how the real world worked had created a new model for how that world could operate. The transformation in family dynamics was gradual but unmistakable. Victoria's comments about my work shifted from skeptical warnings to curious inquiries. She began asking detailed questions about my tenant selection process, my mentorship programs, my expansion plans. During family gatherings, she'd mention my initiative to her friends and colleagues, describing it with the kind of pride she'd previously reserved for Marcus's legal victories and David's political connections. The change was most apparent during my father's retirement party, a formal dinner attended by Pentagon officials, military contractors, and Washington's defense industry elite. Victoria introduced me to her circle of real estate professionals, not as Richard's daughter from his first marriage, but as Maya Chen, who founded the Pentagon Property Development Initiative. She spoke about my work with genuine enthusiasm, highlighting the program's success metrics and strategic innovations. Later that evening, as the party wound down and guests began departing, Victoria approached me with a glass of champagne and an expression I'd never seen before, something that looked almost like respect. "I owe you an apology," she said without preamble. "For years, I believed that success in real estate required a certain type of personality, a specific approach to relationships and risk management. I thought your methods were too unconventional, too idealistic. I was wrong." She took a sip of champagne and looked out at the room where Pentagon officials were discussing potential collaborations with my tenant companies. "What you've built isn't just a business. It's an ecosystem. You've created value in ways I never understood were possible. You've proven that there are multiple paths to success, and sometimes the unconventional path leads to destinations no one else even knew existed." The apology was more complete than I'd ever expected to receive, more honest than I'd thought Victoria was capable of offering. But what struck me most wasn't her acknowledgement of past mistakes. It was her recognition of what I'd actually accomplished. She finally saw not just the financial success, but the systemic change. Not just the property acquisition, but the community transformation. Not just the business growth, but the broader impact. Standing in that room filled with people who'd once dismissed me as too young, too inexperienced, too idealistic to understand serious business, I realized that Victoria's initial dismissal had given me something invaluable: the motivation to prove that success could be defined differently, achieved unconventionally, and measured by standards beyond simple profit accumulation. The girl who'd been told she'd never own anything had created something that couldn't be bought, sold, or replicated by others. I'd built not just a business but a legacy, not just wealth but wisdom, not just property but purpose. Victoria's predictions had become the catalyst for achievements she'd never imagined possible, and her eventual recognition felt less like vindication than validation of a path I'd chosen regardless of her approval. I'd learned to build something stronger than ownership, more valuable than money, and more lasting than any single property acquisition. I built the confidence to define success on my own terms, pursue opportunities others couldn't see, and create value in ways that transformed not just my own life but the lives of everyone who came through my doors. 2 years later, I stood on the observation deck of the newly completed Chen Strategic Building, a 47-story mixed-use complex that had transformed an entire city block 3 miles from the Pentagon. The building wasn't just my headquarters. It was a vertical ecosystem of small businesses, government contractors, technology startups, and nonprofit organizations, all connected by shared resources, collaborative spaces, and the kind of integrated support network that I dreamed about during those early days in my 400-square-foot office. The morning sun caught the building's glass facade, sending geometric patterns of light across the surrounding streets where coffee shops, restaurants, and service businesses had sprouted to support the thousands of people who worked in what journalists had dubbed Maya's Village. The transformation hadn't happened overnight. It had taken 3 years of careful planning, strategic partnerships, and the kind of patient capital deployment that traditional developers usually avoided. But the result was something unprecedented: a self-sustaining business district that prioritized community development alongside profit generation. From my vantage point 47 floors above the street, I could see the physical manifestation of an idea that had started with a simple observation. Successful businesses thrived not in isolation, but in connection with each other. The Chen Strategic Building wasn't just a collection of leased offices. It was a carefully orchestrated symphony of complementary enterprises, shared services, and collaborative opportunities that created value for every participant while generating sustainable returns for the development company. The project had attracted international attention from urban planners, business development specialists, and government officials interested in replicating the model in other cities. Delegations from Japan, Singapore, and Germany had toured the facility. Harvard Business School had written 3 case studies analyzing our innovative approach to mixed-use development. The United Nations had invited me to speak at their annual conference on sustainable urban development. But perhaps the most satisfying recognition had come from an unexpected source. The Pentagon had approached me about developing a similar complex on military property, creating integrated spaces for defense contractors, research organizations, and support services. The same institution where I'd started with a tiny office and a folding table now wanted me to revolutionize how they approached contractor relations and facility management. The irony wasn't lost on me. Victoria had spent years telling me I didn't understand how the real world worked, that my ideas were too theoretical, too idealistic for practical application. Now my supposedly impractical approach was being studied, replicated, and adopted by institutions around the globe. The girl who'd been dismissed as naive had developed business methodologies that were reshaping how people thought about property development, community building, and economic growth. My personal office occupied the northeast corner of the 45th floor, with panoramic views of the Pentagon, the Potomac River, and the Washington Monument in the distance. The space was deliberately designed to feel more like a living room than a corporate headquarters. Comfortable seating areas, art from local artists, shelves lined with books on architecture, urban planning, and business development. The formality of traditional executive offices had always felt performative to me. I preferred spaces that encouraged conversation, creativity, and the kind of relaxed interaction that led to unexpected innovations. That morning, I was reviewing proposals for the next phase of expansion when my assistant announced that Victoria had arrived for our scheduled meeting. I'd been expecting her visit, though I wasn't entirely sure what had prompted her request for a formal appointment. Our relationship had evolved significantly over the past few years, but she rarely visited my office without a specific agenda. She entered wearing an impeccably tailored navy suit and carrying a leather portfolio that looked expensive enough to fund a small startup. Her expression was composed but alert, the look of someone preparing for a conversation she'd rehearsed but wasn't entirely comfortable having. I gestured toward the seating area near the windows, and we settled into chairs that faced each other across a low table where I'd arranged coffee and pastries from the bakery on the building's third floor. "This is quite impressive," Victoria said, her eyes scanning the office and the view beyond. "The entire building, really." I drove through the surrounding area before coming up, and the transformation is remarkable. "You've created something truly special here." I thanked her for the compliment and waited. Victoria wasn't someone who made social visits to offer praise. There was always an agenda, always a purpose that would reveal itself once she'd completed whatever preliminary observations she felt were necessary. She opened her portfolio and removed a manila folder thick with documents. "I wanted to discuss a proposition with you, actually. Something that's been developing over the past several months." She paused, organizing her thoughts with the precision of someone who'd built a career on persuasive presentation. "I'm planning to retire from active real estate practice next year. I've built a substantial portfolio over the past 25 years. But I've reached the point where I want to transition from day-to-day operations to strategic oversight." The folder contained detailed financial statements, property listings, and market analyses for Victoria's real estate holdings. Her portfolio was indeed substantial. Residential properties, commercial developments, and investment holdings scattered across 3 states, with a combined value approaching $50 million. She'd built an impressive business through decades of careful acquisition, strategic positioning, and the kind of relationship-based networking that had always been her specialty. "I've been considering various succession options," she continued, her voice taking on the formal tone she used for significant business discussions. "Partnership with established firms, outright sale to investment groups, gradual liquidation through market sales. But none of those approaches felt quite right. They all involved handing over control to people who didn't understand the property's histories, the relationships I've built with clients, or the strategic vision that guided my acquisition decisions." She met my eyes directly, and I saw something I'd never noticed before: uncertainty, mixed with what looked almost like vulnerability. "I'd like to propose a different approach. I want to merge my portfolio with Chen Strategic Properties, with you, as the majority partner and primary decision maker. I would retain a minority stake and serve in an advisory capacity, but operational control would transfer to you entirely." The proposition was so unexpected that I needed a moment to process its implications. Victoria was offering to place her life's work under my direction, to trust me with business relationships she'd spent decades cultivating, to acknowledge not just my current success but my superior judgment about future opportunities. It was the ultimate reversal of the hierarchy she'd maintained for 20 years. The student becoming the teacher, the dismissed child becoming the recognized authority. But more than that, it was an acknowledgement of something deeper. Victoria wasn't just recognizing my business acumen. She was acknowledging that my unconventional approach had produced results that exceeded her traditional methods. She was admitting that the girl she'd once dismissed as too theoretical, too idealistic, too naive to understand real estate, had developed insights and capabilities that surpassed her own. I asked about her motivations, her timeline, her expectations for the transition process. She answered each question with the thoroughness of someone who'd already considered every angle, every potential complication, every scenario that might arise during the integration process. Her preparation was characteristically complete, but her deference to my judgment was entirely unprecedented. "Why me?" I asked finally. "You could partner with any number of established firms with more resources, broader networks, longer track records in residential and commercial development. What makes you believe that Chen Strategic Properties is the right choice for your portfolio?" Victoria was quiet for a long moment, looking out at the view of Washington stretching toward the horizon. When she spoke, her voice carried a note I'd never heard before, something that sounded almost like humility. "Because you've proven that there are ways to create value that I never understood were possible. Your approach to business development, community building, sustainable growth, it's not just different from mine, it's better, more effective, more innovative, more aligned with where the industry is headed." She paused, then added, "I spent years thinking that success in real estate required a specific type of personality, a particular approach to relationships and risk management. You've shown me that success can be achieved through methods I never considered, by creating value in ways I never imagined." The conversation continued for 2 hours as we discussed technical details, legal structures, and implementation timelines. But the real substance of the meeting had been contained in that moment of acknowledgement. Victoria's recognition that the girl she'd once dismissed had developed capabilities that exceeded her own, that the unconventional approaches she'd criticized had produced superior results, that the future of real estate development lay in directions she hadn't anticipated. 3 months later, we completed the merger that created Chen Blackwood Strategic Properties, with me as CEO and majority shareholder, Victoria as senior advisor and minority partner. The integration process revealed the full scope of what she'd built, not just property holdings, but relationships with contractors, architects, city planners, and financial institutions that spanned decades of careful cultivation. Her network complemented mine in ways that created immediate synergies and opened opportunities neither of us could have pursued independently. But the most significant change wasn't in our business capabilities, it was in our personal relationship. Working together as partners rather than stepmother and stepdaughter, we discovered mutual respect that had been impossible within the family hierarchy that had defined our interactions for 20 years. Victoria's experience and connections, combined with my innovation and strategic vision, created a collaboration that was more productive than either of us had anticipated. The success of our partnership attracted attention from business media, industry organizations, and academic researchers interested in studying unconventional corporate structures. We were featured on the cover of Commercial Real Estate Weekly, interviewed for a Harvard Business Review article about intergenerational knowledge transfer, and invited to speak at conferences about innovative approaches to business succession. During one of these presentations at the National Association of Real Estate Developers annual conference, Victoria introduced me to an audience of 1,500 industry professionals as the most visionary developer of her generation, someone who understands that building communities is more important than building buildings. The introduction was generous and genuine, but what struck me most was her comfort in positioning herself as my supporting partner rather than my senior authority. After the presentation, as we were walking through the conference center, Victoria made an observation that captured something essential about our transformed relationship. "You know, I spent so many years trying to teach you how to succeed in real estate that I never stopped to learn from what you were discovering about the industry. I was so focused on what I thought you needed to know that I missed what you were figuring out on your own." She paused near a display of architectural models representing innovative development projects from around the world. "I realize now that my predictions about your future were wrong, not because you lacked the qualities necessary for success, but because I couldn't imagine forms of success that didn't look like mine. You created something I never would have thought possible, because you approached the business from directions I never would have considered." That evening we had dinner at a restaurant overlooking the harbor where the conference was being held. The conversation ranged across topics we'd never discussed as family members. Her early struggles establishing herself in a male-dominated industry, my experiences as a young entrepreneur navigating government bureaucracy, the evolution of real estate development practices over the past decades, our shared observations about emerging trends in commercial property markets. For the first time in our 20-year relationship, we were talking as professional equals rather than authority figure and subordinate, as collaborators rather than critic and defendant. The conversation revealed dimensions of Victoria's experience I'd never understood, and aspects of my own development I'd never articulated, even to myself. As we prepared to leave, Victoria reached across the table and placed her hand over mine, a gesture of affection that felt natural rather than performed. I want you to know that watching you build what you've created has been one of the most educational experiences of my life. You've taught me that there are ways to approach business, community, and relationships that I never considered. I'm grateful for the opportunity to learn from you, and I'm proud to be your partner. The acknowledgement was complete and genuine, free of the subtle qualifications and conditional praise that had characterized her recognition in previous years. She wasn't just accepting my success, she was celebrating my innovations, learning from my methods, and positioning herself as a beneficiary of my insights, rather than a contributor to my development. 6 months later, I received a package at my office, with no return address but handwriting I recognized immediately. Inside was a small jewelry box containing a pair of emerald earrings that had belonged to my mother, along with a note written in Victoria's precise script. These belonged to someone who would be proud of everything you've accomplished. She always believed you would own something beautiful, something meaningful, something entirely your own. She was right. The gift was more than jewelry. It was a restoration of connection to my mother's memory, an acknowledgement of the foundation she'd provided for everything I'd built, a recognition that my achievements honored her hopes rather than exceeded her expectations. Victoria's note contained no apology, no explanation, just a simple statement that connected my current success to my earliest source of encouragement and support. I placed the earrings in the small safe behind my desk, next to the original lease agreement for my first Pentagon office, and the letter from James Rothwell offering to purchase my property portfolio. They represented different forms of validation: the billionaire's recognition of my business acumen, the legal documentation of my professional growth, and now Victoria's acknowledgement of something deeper than commercial success. Standing in my office that afternoon, looking out at the thriving business district I'd created, I reflected on the journey from that first day when Victoria told me I'd never own anything worth having. The girl she'd dismissed as naive and impractical had built something that transcended simple ownership: a community, a methodology, a legacy that would continue generating value long after any individual property transaction was forgotten. Victoria's initial prediction had become the catalyst for achievements she'd never anticipated. Her limitations had become my launching pad, and her eventual recognition felt less like vindication than validation of a path I'd chosen regardless of her approval. I'd learned to build something stronger than ownership, more valuable than money, and more lasting than any single acquisition. The phone rang, interrupting my reflection. My assistant announced that a delegation from the European Union was requesting a meeting to discuss replicating our development model in Brussels. Another call waiting was from a publisher interested in a book about innovative approaches to commercial real estate. A third message was from the mayor's office about expanding our community development initiatives to other neighborhoods throughout the city. Each opportunity represented recognition that extended far beyond Victoria's initial dismissal or even her current partnership. The world had noticed what we'd built, not just as a successful business, but as a new way of thinking about property development, community building, and sustainable economic growth. The girl who'd been told she'd never own anything had created something that couldn't be owned by anyone else. Ideas, methodologies, and innovations that would influence how people approached real estate development for decades to come. I'd proven that Victoria's version of my story had been wrong from the very beginning, not through spite or revenge, but through the patient construction of something beautiful, meaningful, and entirely my own. Her predictions had become my motivation, her skepticism had become my fuel, and her eventual recognition had become confirmation of what I'd always known was possible. The building around me hummed with the activity of hundreds of businesses, thousands of employees, and countless collaborations that created value in ways that couldn't be measured by traditional metrics. This was ownership redefined. Not just legal title to property, but stewardship of community, cultivation of opportunity, and creation of lasting positive impact. Victoria had been wrong about what I could achieve, but she'd been right about one thing. Real estate was about relationships. She'd simply underestimated my capacity to build them in ways she'd never considered, with people she'd never thought to engage, for purposes she'd never imagined were possible. The girl who'd never been expected to own anything had created something that belonged to everyone who walked through our doors, worked in our spaces, and benefited from the ecosystem we'd built together. Up next, you've got 2 more standout stories right on your screen. If this one hit the mark, you won't want to pass these up. Just click and check them out.